Are you like all done? No, sorry.
You spent any time?
Actually, all done.
No.
We're closing on our new house.
Oh, right.
Sold the other one now.
All business. Basically, a lot of time over there. A lot of time.
Wait,
Up there.
no way. Yeah.
Now it's, yeah.
It's like, I think some working on Monday, so they end up getting started. They're not going to pay them. They might, they want us to go in today, so we got.
What is going on over here?
Oh, it's testing the audio.
Okay. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Seeing we have a critical mass here. All right, so I think this is our last visiting seminar speaker of the semester. So this is save the best for last thing. Let's say. Yeah, so we have the pleasure today of welcoming Ben Jones. Ben is just recently started a postdoc at MIT in Wojciech-Matuszyk's group. Prior to that, he's a recent graduate of University of Washington, where he did his PhD working with Adriana Schultz, who is also soon to join us here at Brown. And Ben has done a whole bunch of cool work in broadly under the umbrella of computational fabrication and design, everything from domain-specific languages to computational knitting to a lot of stuff in computer-aided design, in particular in applying sort of modern machine learning technologies to CAD through some interesting novel representation design stuff, which I think he's going to be mostly focusing on today. So yeah, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ben.
Well, thanks so much for having me. So yeah, you probably noticed that AI is having a bit of a moment right now. Obviously, data-hungry models have quickly gobbled up like all the text, images, code, video, and audio that's readily available on the web. Like, what's the next frontier? What are we going to ingest next with these models? What about the remanufactured objects we've ever made? Because nearly every manufactured object in the modern world probably started its life as a 3D model and CAD program. Things in this room, like this TV or the fan, or the chairs, all of these have some associated CAD model. So there should be a ton of data out there for us to source. Which leaves a different question. How and should we be integrating AI into CAD systems? So CAD is a big blanket term, but becomes synonymous with technical 3D modeling for most people lately. But I think to understand why it's been such a successful paradigm, we really need to look at what this really means. So CAD, stands for computer-aided design. I think we all know what computers are, and we know what helping is. But the part that really worth digging into is what design means. Because to know how and why CAD is, we need to understand what the design part means. So I'm going to paraphrase from Bill Burnett here and say that design is the process through which people solve problems, which probably sounds way overly vague in general, and it totally is. There are like 1,000,001 books out there to read to understand what design is and how to do it. We'll say different things. They all tend to agree on one thing, which is that design is an iterative process. But here I've laid out a common breakdown of the cycle and bring in like the definition, ideation, implementations, and evaluations. So when you're designing, you usually start out figuring out what your problem actually is, what you're trying to solve. So at this stage, you might try to figure out what are my criteria or metrics for success, and what are constraints measurement, what makes the solution valid. Next, you need to have an idea of it. What kind of things can you try? So here's where you're going to brainstorm designs to prototype and evaluate. Next, you're going to actually implement that. You're going to prototype. You're going to take your idea, make it a reality in some way. And you need to, at this stage, realize it in sufficient detail such that you can evaluate those metrics that you determine are necessary to see if you're on the right track. And finally, decide, was this a good idea or not? So in this stage, you both want to evaluate your prototypes against objectives and constraints, as well as look for constraints and objectives that were missed. So they come back around, you can look at the problem definition again, and if that repeats. So when we look at this loop, we'll notice this one word pops up again and again. Design, 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 design. But it's a noun this time. We just said it was a verb. What's up with that? Well, people use the word design in a different way. Which I'll say is a representation. What do I mean by representation here? Well, We need to have representation for design because fully realizing the idea at every stage of design process is kind of impractical. We can't just like build a dozen test buildings just to find the one that we actually want. Instead, we're going to use proxy models to approximate the stage of design and the evaluation requirements at each stage. So early on in building design, you might just kind of talk to your friend about, these are kind of the ideas I have. Like in brainstorming, you might sketch out to block forms. And depending on what your evaluation needs are, you might try different kinds of implementations. If you're trying to sell a client on a building, you might make a nice render for them. But if you're trying to appease the planning department, you might need some blueprints. So these representations are chosen based on the task we supported, the constraints that the design is to have, and who or what will be using them. And multiple of these representations will appear within the same design iteration. So oftentimes in one iteration of design, you'll start with a less concrete idea, like maybe some words about it or a simple sketch. And then as you try to evaluate things, maybe you want to just do some simulation or some aesthetic rendering or evaluate some constraints for the planning department, you need to realize it more concretely to be able to evaluate this metric. So when we're choosing a representation for design, we're going to evaluate what are the constraints of the problem, what tasks is enabled, who or what will be working with the design format, and they're going to tend to move from abstract to concrete throughout the design process. All right, but what about CAD? So far, this is ostensibly talk about CAD in the sense that we understand it as manufacturing, but I've talked most about generic design loops. Modern CAD systems are built to work within this design loop. Once you know that the solution you're looking for, it's constrained to be some manufacturable object, and that the subproblem you're trying to solve is what is the form and function of that object. So let's look at modern CAD as people kind of know this right now, you've probably seen before. Currently, these tools tend to support more the implementation and evaluation side of the design loop. So you might be familiar with 3D modeling programs like SolidWorks or Onshape, like build geometry. These programs also tend to look at assembly model, figuring out how the pieces of geometry come together in other forms. There are also a lot of CAM, computer and manufacturing planning. So how do you go from one of these geometric designs to instructions for a lathe or some other actual fabrication process to build these things, which is necessary for doing evaluations. Or you can do your evaluation through simulating things digitally, or maybe if you want more of a static evaluation, high quality rendering. The tools we generally speak of when we talk about like a CAD tool are really mostly on this modeling side. And these tools get their power from working with two different representations, going from less concrete to more concrete, which are procedural CAD programs for defining the geometry, and then parametric geometry called boundary representations for capturing what that geometry is in a valuable way. So let's look back at our criteria for design and see how this fits into CAD. What are the constraints for a problem? It has to be manufacturable, which means it needs to be precise and accurate geometry, because you don't want your gears to be grinding. It's going to work. The task enables. You want to, first of all, enable iterative design. You want to be able to not restart from scratch every time we go to the design loop. We also want to support things like modeling, rendering, CAM, and simulation. And who or what can you work in this? Most of the tools built so far have been built for human designers working in graphical programs. And the tendency to move from more abstract to more concrete. So usually designers mean working in a graphical program, their inputs to the graphical program will change an underlying procedural model, which will then generate out this geometry. So that's what works in practice. Here's a typical parametric modeling workflow. So a user interacts with this graphical interface and iteratively builds up a 2D and then 3D geometry, slowly building into the final design. You'll see they made a sketch, they extruded it, made another sketch, and then we extrude that down. And I finally have it, capability. Made in that shape. So I want you to pay attention to this list on the left of features being built up. So each of these is a command that's executed whenever the user is interacting with the interface. And together they create a procedure or a program that's generating this model. So let's break down this look like. So first, the user is going to interact with this interface. It's going to modify the CAD program. The program will be executed and generate parametric geometry. More on what that is later. The parametric geometry will then be visualized back to the user, and the cycle begins again. An important actor under the hood here is what's called a geometric kernel or a CAD kernel. This is a specialized piece of software that knows how to manipulate the parametric geometry. That is a very specialized format. And it's responsible for executing the instructions that the CAD program has. So it's kind of the kernel of this programming language run on top of. And also for creating the visualizations for user interaction. All right. So at the core of this recipe are two main representations, parametric geometry and CAD programs. And they're interrelated, and that the CAD program generates parametric geometry, and parametric geometry is a reference by the CAD program. I'll go into more detail what is meant by referencing in a point. But I want to argue right now that these representation choices give parametric CAD its primary advantages. So parametric geometry format allows for arbitrary precision, which is needed for manufacturing while enabling the representation of smooth geometry and sharp features. It also explicitly contains referenceable substructures that the user can interact with. And having an underlying program allows for the specification of accurate dimensions. So subparts of the program can be locally edited to make design changes by completely changing parts of the editability we talked about, as well as having parameters for changing things. So I summarize these advantages as precision, accuracy, and editability. Three things you need to have a CAD program be usable in the design loop. So I just threw out a bunch of claims there, including referencing the thing, and it's a good thing to have. So let's dig a little bit more into what these representations are and how they work together. So first, parametric geometry. We'll take the example of this box with a hole in it. So this is kind of the typical kind of geometry you can see in a manufactured object, where it has a lot of smooth surfaces with sharp edges. So in a CAD system, this object will be broken up into pieces, which are faces, edges, and vertices. This is what we call the topology of the shape, or its topological entities. And to capture the shape precisely, each of these entities is associated with the parametric equation that represents this geometry. So these equations make surfaces, points, and curves. And these topological entities don't just float in space, they have relationships to each other. Specifically, faces are bounded by edges, and edges are bounded by vertices. So these boundary associations transitively relate all the entities into a topological graph, which becomes clear if we stop visualizing all the geometry, so we can just see the nodes and links. The reason this is important to do, by the way, is because these kind of parametric equations don't have boundaries by default. Kind of a plane goes on forever, so you need to have some of the geometry to cut out the shapes you care about. So this data structure we're looking at is called the parametric boundary representation, or PBREP. This is kind of the lingua franca of the CAD world. Basically, any commercial CAD program you see is using this algorithm, and it's using that as a data exchange format. So one of the crucial features I mentioned earlier is referenceable substructure. So these are the topological entities, faces, edges, and vertices, as well as a couple of higher order structures that are beyond the scope of this talk. So these are the references, the entities will be directly referenced. So if someone wants to extrude from a face, they need to have a way of selecting it, and having it be a graph image that really needs to be selected. All right, so now we'll take a little closer look at this still that we looked at in the CAD video. So here the designer is adding a hole to the box by extruding out a circular face. So the list of operations at the left forms the program that they define the UI, and each line of this is a function call. The little pop-up box you're seeing here, this is how the user specifies the inputs of the function, the arguments. So here highlighted in red, it says face of sketch 2. So this face is actually the face in the BREP sense. It's exactly one of those graph nodes. So here's how repping works, is that the program actually takes as its arguments the geometric structure, which is why you have to have this tight loop of each stage of the program generating parametric geometry, because that input the next stage of the program. All right. Now they're all on the same page about like what modern CAD is. We can go back to our central question: how to interface this kind of a system with AI. So we'll look at a slide we looked at earlier. Just add AI. That's what people are doing in this, right? So, all right, this looks the same as it was before. We still have the same constraints. We want this to be precise and accurate geometry. We still want it to be editable. And who's going to work with it? Well, we want human designers, graphic firms, and machines. But none of this was designed with machine in mind. So our little robot friend is very sad now. All right. So what do we need if we're going to make this work with AI? Well, first, we still need to have all of those constraints held. So we need to support the core design loop. We need to enable ideation, evaluation, design, and control. We need to maintain the precision and accuracy. So how do we do this? Well, Also edit build. That's pretty useful. So to do this, kind of have two choices. Either we can create new representations that have all these properties, or we can try to build representation learning systems that can interface with the existing representations that we already know have these properties. So most of what we're going to look at the beginning here is using the strategy of using existing representations, both because we already know they have properties and because that's what existing engineers are going to know how to work with. And so these systems become immediately applicable. All right, so now we're going to move into the technical portion of the talk. Here I will give an overview of how the product will discuss fit into the design layer. So the first section I'm going to talk about is representation learning. So how to get existing machine learning systems to work with existing representations. I'll talk about a representation learning strategy for VREPs, and show a couple of applications, but one for automatically finding functional mates, and then for a correspondence matching problem that comes up a lot in actual practical engineering flows. And then we'll talk a little bit about a project for doing few-shot learning to enable evaluation of learning evaluation of small data sets. And then next, we're going to move into more of the early stages of analytics, the ideation and early implementation, by looking at how we can use foundational image models to help us explore the space of possible designs and make parametric CAD programs. And finally, look at how to use foundational language models to kind of generate these programs directly. And keep in mind always that every time you go around this loop, you still need to be thinking about what you learned. So human design never actually fully leaves through these. Right, fine. So let's start out with representation learning. So we want to learn representation. What does that mean? Well, we want to take into a VREP, which is the structure of a bunch of faces, edges, and vertices, throw some machine learning at it somehow, and get out some vector feature embedding for each entity that we can use in downstream learning tasks. To do this, we're going to take advantage of the fact that VREPs look like graphs, and we'll use graphical language for this. For the purpose of this talk, all you need to know the GNN is a magic machine that takes as input a graph with fixed size vector embeddings in the nodes and sometimes edges, applies a process called message passing that applies to each edge, and gets out new vector embeddings for each edge and node with some learnable parameters to along the way. So when we draw it like this, a VREP looks like a really hairy, messy graph. It's kind of hard and difficult to apply one of these, expensive to apply one of these processes on. But it turns out they actually have a lot of structure. So if we reorganize the graph by geometry type, we can see that VREPs actually compose into a stack of bipartite graph layers. This will allow us to structure our message passing in one direction, going up through layers, in every enter type without exploiting the computational complexity. We can then gather some neighborhood information and pass information back down. So this general structure of using the hierarchical structure of the VREP to our advantage to reduce the computational complexity is what I call like a hierarchical VREP GNN or a structured VREP GNN, TCM. And this is the learning technique we're going to use to create tools for engineering. So again, two tools I'm going to talk about here, two applications of this. One is an application to autocomplete assemblies. So taking a bunch of pieces of geometry and putting them together in a functional part. And the other is correspondence matching for collaboration. So figuring out which entities in one VREP match to a semantically similar but geometrically different. So we'll start by talking about assemblies. So complex CAD objects aren't just one piece of geometry. There are a bunch of different pieces of geometry that interface, and the interfaces are defined by constraints between them that specify how they're connected and how they can move relative to one another. Traditionally, this is done by manually defining each of these constraints. So again, here is a user creating one of these constraints in traditional CAD program. They have to go through, select a bunch of pieces of geometry, define the orientations of the relative frames, and finally create one constraint. So that took a bit of time to do one. You have to do it for every piece of geometry in a system. And in general, this takes about 1/3 of the time for modeling some complex object. So we developed a recommender system that just takes two parts. You make rough selections to indicate the user's intent of roughly where you want to connect them, and then suggests the most likely way to connect them and lets you instantly connect it without having to specify all these parameters. In order to do this, we had to train this on a large data set. So we scraped and cleaned a large collection of assemblies from Onshape, an online first CAD system. We got about 500,000 mates about 100,000 assemblies. And feeding this to SVGCN and the Siamese network, we're able to create a recommender that takes things that look like this. So we have two pieces of geometry, and the yellow highlights are where the user is roughly indicated to want to connect. And it'll produce a ranked list of outputs. For example, in this case, the red one highlighted here is what in our data set was said that they was actually done with this geometry. We also asked some mechanical engineers to label what would be useful to do with this. We see, like in this example, most of our highly recommended suggestions are things that you actually want to do. This is to say that the numbers that I'm going to show next are a lower bound estimate of the accuracy of the system, because you don't know until you have the rest of the context which of these you want to use. And we want to have a system that's useful for new applications, not just things that have already done. So here what we're looking at is the lower bound accuracy across all of our test set. The x-axis is how many suggestions we're going to show to the user, and the y is the percentage of the time that we get the right answer. So our system got about 72% accuracy. Is this any good? Well, if we just randomly select things, we're only getting about 30%. And crucially, I think what's interesting to look at is if you look at our traditional geometric networks, like using a point cloud and regression-based techniques like snapping position, you can only get about 45% accuracy with the same data set. So this is really just highlighting how using a CAD native representations doesn't just get you better integration of the tools, it also gets you better results. Yes.
Thanks, man. Can I ask a question about what location means in this?
Yeah, so I mentioned that when you're defining a mate between parts,
Yeah.
you have to define two things, which is where do they connect, and then what is the degrees of freedom. So this is specifying where they connect. In particular, this is trying to predict the topological entities that are going to be connecting together. And for different kinds of topological entities, there's different like reasonable positions and orientations to get position orientations. Like you're connecting the faces on face center, or you're connecting them on the edited center. This is a discrete choice.
And reasonable is derived from the B-records.
Yeah, so the reasonable is derived actually initially from the underlying CAD systems. So underlying CAD systems, when you're generating these mates, in this sort of a CAD system, you kind of select the entities that you want to match, and then you're given a combinatorial choice of how you want to attach those two entities together. And so this is once you have candidate entities, and you have candidate choices, we can notice ranking all those and choosing the top ones. Yeah. Cool.
And so this works by just having you mentioned like a Siamese network at some point. This works just by basically, it's a system that takes the sort of two B-reps kind of posed relative to each other, then sort of outputs a score for each of them, and you
Yeah, we don't actually end up posing them relative to each other. The relative posing is given by like a selection. The user select a face.
I see.
And everything, and basically what we say is that if the user clicks somewhere on the B-rep, that's kind of how you select something in the system. Everything that's adjacent to what they clicked is considered a candidate for connecting, and then we find the combination of all the possible connection types there and rank those. And so we're limiting, usually if you check every pairwise pair of entities, you get, hundreds of thousands, millions of combinations for a complex object. We want to get some idea of the user and kind of roughly where it connects. So we're looking at a local neighborhood.
Right.
We chose a local neighborhood of what's adjacent, but you could also think about doing this in terms of like some ball around where user.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so that neighborhood is why random performance is so high.
Yeah. The random performance would be like basically zero if it was over the entire parts. But we wanted to give these things as fair of a shot as possible. So like the regression ones here also is able to regress and then snap to the rest thing exactly and have a template. And what's actually going on here is that since there are so many things locally, even if your regression gets close, it can snap to the wrong thing really easily. Which is why having this combinatorial is actually really fun. Yeah. Cool. All right. Awesome. All right. So second application was correspondence matching. So imagine you're designing like this engine and a cylinder, and these connect to each other. So when you're designing these parts, the engineer will usually model the interface by reference to the original design. So rather than cutting out a circle with a particular radius, they'll say, cut out a circle with the same radius as this circle. This is one of the really powerful things about referential CAD programming is that you can have these programs dependent on one another in a really useful way. So that ideally, in the best use case, when you have a design iteration, changes in one part will update and automatically resize the other parts so things can just work together. So this is enabled by this robust naming scheme that internally exists in CAD programs. They understand the history of the design, and so they can know that, okay, this circle is the same as the circle in some way. But that's not actually the real world situation, unfortunately, in a lot of engineering systems, because engineering is a team game. And so often you'll actually have different teams of people working on different parts of a system. So you might have one team working on the cylinder, one team working on the engine base, and team A will hand off the geometry to team B. Might work in an entirely different CAD system. And remember, these B reps, they didn't have any notion of the names of things. They just had raw geometry. So this person's going to import a B rep and get no references. So they import it, they need to make the references manually themselves. And that works just fine for computing. But then if team A changes their design, import it again, no references. And so now you have these references in your program that have no correspondence. You have to go manually get through, click them all back. That's really time consuming. And if you have some sort of automated method that does it poorly, that becomes a silent error in your program. So that's dangerous. So what are we going to do? We propose to learn a B-rep matching algorithm using SVGCN that learns to correspond every entity in as many entities as you can in two different related parts. And then we can use that to refill entities that have kind of this dream of automatic updating work across collaborations. So again, to this, we need a data set. In this case, we took all the models that we just scraped for.
Can I ask a quick question about this? I might be missing something, but it seems like one solution to this problem is if team A is the one that did this iteration, that the tool they were using should already know the correspondence between every entity in the edited BREF and the original one. And so is there not a way to send that information somehow to the second team?
That would be lovely.
Yeah.
And if CAD vendors wanted to be less code copy of each other, they would totally export that, but they don't. So the problem here is that the common interchange format is just
This
the
is
geometry format, BREPs.
Okay.
And all this extra metadata is unique to that program. So for example, this naming scheme in some programs might be history based.
Okay.
In some programs it might be geometry based. Some people might be actually opening this correspondence. Some it's like an on the fly computer thing. Because like these correspondences aren't entirely robust all the time either.
Right.
There can't
No,
be.
I'm aware of that issue, yeah.
Yeah.
So it seems like basically the lowest common denominator thing is just assume all you have is a BREP. You just have to go from that.
Exactly, and this is kind of like trying to work towards the situation we have on the ground, which is that you're importing things and you need to have a way to make these references work.
Yeah.
Which is a lot of these projects are about like work with the data we have, not the data we wish we had.
Yeah.
And so speaking of data we have, what do we have? We have all of these models that we'd scraped for the mating project. So what we're going to do is create a bunch of synthetic training examples by generating a bunch of deformations, either constructive operations where we like extrude bits out, or deformations where we pull on things, and like a combination of these. And because we do this within one CAD system, we can use this auto-generated matches to construct a synthetic data set of here are what the entities correspond to if there exists a correspondence. At the same time, we also hired an expert engineer to curate some examples of like real world complexity parts and label the correspondences so we can validate this works. So train up a system, I'm not going to talk too much about how that works internally, but it's an iterative matching system with an heuristic in the middle. And what we're looking at here is kind of in red and blue, the difference between the two parts, or gray looks the same, then added and subtracted pieces, and colored correspondences, so the colored correspondences we found. And so ground truth, which is ours, they look very similar. We'll see one bit in beige over there where we missed one correspondence, but we didn't say anything wrong about it. We would have highlighted that red. So quantitatively, one is what we were measuring is true matches, so things that match that should have matched. Correctly unmatched entities, because sometimes new pieces of geometry appear. We shouldn't match those. The matches we could have made, but we missed. Faces that we matched the wrong entities, and faces that we matched to something that shouldn't have been matched at all. So blue good, beige neutral, red harmful. And when I say neutral, I mean the beige is the situation would have been out without this system, and red is silent errors. In our system, we have a knob we can tune to change that error rate. We chose 2%. That's roughly what we're hitting as a target, but you can make that go smaller at the expense of making the beige get bigger. So this was just numbers across spaces, but if we look at different kinds of entities, we see a roughly the same pattern. We're hitting about 90% accuracy at a 2% error rate, which I think is pretty good. In fact, this is there are some commercial systems that use their own internal heuristics to do this, and this is matching or better. It's actually significantly better than most of the performances. So one thing I did mention, this is all synthetic, but we have this validation set. These look more like this. And luckily, we actually see very similar values. Like we really want to be looking at the size of red, beige, and blue here, because in the real world situation, the percentages of how many things have changed are different. So yeah, usable system. All right, I think we're getting close. I'm gonna speed through here a little bit. Final project in this set I wanted to look at was what to do in low data regime. So both the projects look at Spark relying on these very large set of in the wild or synthetic labels, but engineers are expensive, and so labeled data sets for CAD are actually pretty rare. But what we do have is a lot of unlabeled data. So there's tons of models out there that you can just download, but they don't have any information about tasks of things, what they are, where things are made, etc. Just raw geometry. So let's try to pre-train something in this to get some sort of learned embeddings that we can use for low data learning. But what should be our loss for this? Well, let's look back at the anatomy of a CAD program. So since ERFs is such a complex structure, they require the CAD kernel to interpret them visually. So what if this is like a common thing for every VREF, regardless of the program which we don't have right now. So what if we trained a network to replace the CAD kernel in the visualization part, do the visualization for us, and use that as a supervision loss. So we could kill two birds with one stone there. We have a solid goal for train supervision, and we remove the remaining dependence in the system on having a CAD kernel because they're expensive and opaque to us. So this is what the system is going to look like. We're going to take in a large unlabeled data set, take VREF models, we're going to put them through some learning encoder, get embeddings for every face, and then we're going to do decoded, what we're calling rasterization, which is essentially function evaluation given a UV coordinate of the face. Can we pull out where it is in space and assign distance field value for it? So we're trying to reconstruct each of these spaces independently. So once we've trained the model to do that, we can then take those labels and create these really, really small task decoders for different tasks. We tested things on part classification, segmentation for machining, or segmentation for modeling. So these are really, really small label networks. We don't fine tune our encodings at all. We don't have any CAD kernels in here. So you can train these networks in literally seconds. It's great. And on very small amounts of data. There's only have time to talk about one application here, which is the segmentation benchmark. So this is important for reverse engineering. So saying if you already have a part, but you want to figure out what the program that came with it, that made it is, you kind of want to figure out what program operations we're likely to have generated each of the parts of this. So we have a segmentation data set, which we luckily happen to have one of the few large data sets out there that's labeled. And if you look at the performance of ours versus ground truth, it looks like it's mostly doing it perfectly. This is training over, we'll leave 100, it's training over all the examples. If we just train on 100 examples though, and compare what happens with ours versus a bunch of other ways of encoding VREFs, even at just 100 examples, we're getting a larger number of faces where most of sampling-based approaches, so you can end up using geometric sampling, or even just SPCN without this large amount of pre-training, even though it's allowed to train and fine-tune all the way and tune its representation all the way through, are really just figuring out what's the mode of the data set, figuring out that most of CAD's extruding. But really going to see the power of having this pre-trained network to figure out essentially how do I deal with this complex geometry format in the first place? Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm super new to this. Are some of these ambiguous operations?
Yes, they are. However, this is a data set that's generated by having known that the programs are. So yes, you could have ambiguity. There is kind of like what is the most likely ordering of making a program.
Maybe James's question is it possible that some of these things which are labeled as ground truth, it's only one one ground truth that could have created that.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
other ways of creating these
Yeah.
programs, and we don't have a program history to know which one 100% did it.
And so it's also one of these things where it's possible that some things that yours or one of these other networks are producing actually could be like traces of valid programs which produce that
True.
shape, just not the one that produced it in that data set.
Yeah, this is true. And the way this data is actually generated is using a Fusion 360 heuristic for figuring out these sort of things. So it's a little sketchy to the heuristic. So we're kind of learning another heuristic here.
Does it make you think of the designers that make the CAD programs having different styles of operation?
That is true, yeah.
But able to produce the same shape in the end. And that seems very difficult to deal with.
It would be, yes. In this case, since this data is all produced from essentially the same designer bias, because there is one heuristic that's being used to figure these out, then we don't have to worry about so much that kind of ambiguity. And really what we're trying to measure here, which I'll show on the next slide, is like what the relationship is between data volume and accuracy. So can we actually train on small data sets? So here we're looking at like a log scale, how many samples you're making from like, 10 examples up to 20,000. And the accuracy, you kind of see that our model starts, down to about 65% and gets to 96, I think that's 96% accuracy. The bars here, widthwise, are showing variance because depending on what sample you show, it might be better or worse. If we look at other methods, we'll see they both work more poorly and have more variance, which means they're more reliant on finding exactly the right examples.
But
yeah.
No, you should go first, James.
No?
Yeah.
I go, mine might be a bit silly. If I just run the heuristic, don't I get 100%?
Yes, you would, but again, using this particular data set as a way of, this is not a problem we care about solving intrinsically.
Yeah.
We're caring about benchmarking how data efficient we are compared to other methods.
Okay, I'm just making sure I understood.
Yeah, so yeah, this is all about data efficiency.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I think I might still have James's previous question of if there's multiple ways to sort of create these shapes, then your accuracy is just sort of how well you predict the one that you made versus any valid way to reconstruct this shape.
Yes, in this particular benchmark. And if we're trying to solve this problem of what is the actual construction sequence, that's a much thornier problem, and I believe there's math research going on here about how to do that. So yeah, I was laughing. I heard a lot about people trying to do that at this point. Yes, Kenny?
I had a question. So this kind of self-supervised learning test that you have, right, is about the visualization. But it seems like there's other self-supervised learning tests you could use, right? Like you could do kind of error correction, or you could have kind of a partial iterative and then try and kind of complete it.
Yeah, so that's actually what UVNetSS does. So this green one is another self-supervised. Thank you for segueing exactly my next point. This green one is a different self-supervised technique, which uses UVNet, which is a sampling-based approach, and tries to do kind of the standard kind of contrast approach where they just deleting pieces from VREFs and then trying to figure out associations. And it performs surprisingly worse. This is even actually after going back and forth with the authors several times trying to get it to work. And our takeaway from this is having, in some sense, learning to actually represent the geometry itself is the most important signal. And so by having a geometric self-supervision, we're actually forcing this network to live the most important parts of the representation rather than yeah. All right. Cool. All right. So talked about the evaluating side of the loop. I'm going to briefly touch on the earlier stages of ideation and implementation. The first project I'm going to talk about here is the foundation models and how to use them to explore space divides. So the promise of parametric CAD modeling is that you can take a model and then be able to explore many different design alternatives just by changing parameters. This would be really cool to be able to do. But it's kind of a false promise. The other problem is that arrives for the constraints. So the constraints you have are not necessarily semantics. Depending on how designers make a model, as been pointed out, there's no guarantee that the model is fully constrained the way it should be. So if I have a parameter for moving the leg of a chair, there's no guarantee that the seat moves with it. You have to kind of program it into your model. And so ultimately you have this chicken and the egg problem. if you need to know what parameters you want or design them into your model. But in design, you kind of need to explore once or twice to figure out what parameters you're going to need. So you need to iterate to know that parameters are important. So you're never going to really design a model that has all the parameters you want out of the gate. But what if we could just make one model that just makes the geometry we want, throw machine learning at it, and get a bunch of parameters out that let us vary the model however we'd like. That's what reparam kind of tries to do. And the way that we do this is we take as many buzzwords as we can and shove them together. So we take a large language model and text image model kind of get semantic chain understanding, and then we use symbolic reasoning to remove noise and to interpret what we get out of the language models. So more concretely, our input is some CAD model and then a text description. So this is a CSG model for a chair and description chair. We're going to then feed chair into a large language model and ask it what kind of different chairs there are, get a bunch of names for different kinds of chairs, feed that into an image model to try to morph this initial chair into a bunch of different types of chairs, so benches, chase lines, rocking chairs, etc. We're then going to take all of these, we're going to run through a constraint discovery process to figure out what are the constraints of the geometry that are common between all of these examples. The things like legs are on the bottom of the chair, the back's attached to the back, usually it's parallel, usually the legs are all at the same level, things like this. And really what we're trying to discover here are what are the constraints that make, what defines chairiness, what makes it favorite chair in terms of constraints. And once we have these, we can reparameterize the original model to allow semantic combinations of the input shapes while adhering to these common constraints so that it stays a chair as you vary parameters. So we apply this technique to a lot of different common shapes, and we are able to vary between a bunch of different shapes from only having one input example. All right, and finally, I'll end this section with an ongoing project that aims to close this loop and generate CAD programs directly. So, problem solved here is that CAD programs are games. Graphical interfaces are difficult to interface with for an AI. So it's an extra level abstraction. What if we just had to write the CAD program directly? So we are designing a CAD language we're calling a design language or ADL. We're targeting this kind of as this 2D/3D interface for laser cutting. And the idea is if we have ADL, I'll make a robot happen. Okay. So LLMs have some issues with CAD. The first is geometry. LLMs are very bad at understanding geometry, which kind of makes sense. They're trained on text. If you ask them to position, to give you coordinates for things, they might tell you, I'm going to put this on the left of the image and then put it over here if they actually give you a real number. The same thing they're not great at is long-range planning. So if we can structure our language such that it can compartmentalize it into smaller problems, that'd be helpful. But they're good at a few things. They're great at making semantic descriptions of objects. They're great at actually kind of decomposing things into the semantic structures. And they understand geometric relations pretty well. They darn well will tell you that legs go underneath the chair. They might not be able to put them there, but they'll tell you they should be there. They also have the ability to use tools, which is crucial. So in our language, we're going to use map these on having semantic naming cues, so making sure that everything in the language is named semantically. We're going to have a hierarchical object structure, which takes advantage of the fact that they can make these structures and also gives us a way of breaking down the planning properly. We're going to specify these geometric relations as constraints, which can then be used in constraint solver as a tool to put things together the way they're supposed to fit together. These constraints have two forms. They have implicit constraints. So if you use references to define things relative to one another, there's an implicit constraint made, or you can explicitly write the constraints of the equation. And then the tool is constraint solver. This is what this language kind of looks like. So we're going to break down an object of this key into a collection of subparts. So in this case, you have a bunch of different solids that are then connected either with addition or subtraction. It's kind of like a CSG. And then to position these, we have constraint equations describing where they are. So for example, say that this named thing, the shank, on the left side is the budding on the right loop. So at the same position. You can also say the bit is to the right, this, etc. So you can imagine different constraint equations that can actually place these in the right positions relative to each other. So if we give this language to the LLM 6GPT-4 and also just a handful of constraint equations, we can actually produce fairly complex, semantically labeled and broken down shapes, such as this telephone that will break into receiver, a base, and a dial plate. And since these programs are code and they're semantically labeled, they're editable. So we can easily go and change the position of this and it kind of moves together properly. Yeah, so this is ongoing work. We're looking at extending this into 3D next. And yeah, I think, how am I doing on time? I think I'm pretty close, right?
We got a few minutes.
Okay. Cool. All right. So we're kind of doing the question along the way. So it'll take 5 more minutes and then open the question. So review, we see that the AI tools that we talked about today seem to spread the breadth of the design loop. So we're done, right? Is this the future of CAD? Unfortunately, no. So first of all, these tools kind of only cover half the design loop, and they also are siloed off from each other. So each of these is a different tool that kind of loses context from the rest. So the overall context of design still just lives in the designer's head between ideation and implementation, and even worse, between different iterations of the design loop. So I think the future of AI and CAD are tools that allow retaining context and assistance across multiple iterations of design. And so what it's going to look like is having some sort of unified AI toolkit that assists the designer throughout the process from initial ideation to final design. I want to argue really quickly that I think multimodal generative models is a good candidate for this options. And as you consider your ideas more and more, you might shift around in what you're considering. This is kind of the redefinition of goals that happens at the beginning of the design loop. But we'll get a kind of narrow and narrower idea of what you want. So finally, you might hit upon a solution. This looks eerily similar to what a promising generative model does, as probability of some solution given a context is a distribution of possible solutions. And as you increase the amount of context you have, generally this distribution will narrow and peak until you get one solution. And hopefully, if this is done in concert with the same context that the human designer has, it will converge toward the same kind of solution. But this is an overly simplistic model. In general, when someone's refining their ideas, they're not refining it in the same representation the whole way. As you mentioned way back in the beginning of the talk, you generally make you go from less concrete to more concrete representations as you iterate through design loops. So you might start with a text description, from that make some sketches. Once you get some sketches you like, make a model, and finally have some concrete solution. So if we wanted to have generative models able to do this, it needs to be able to work natively with multiple different representations pretty fluidly, so it can also refine through these. So there are requirements for a generative model that will work for design across iteration loops. You need to have multiple modalities for both context and solutions. And usually there have to be domain-specific conventions or representations to be able to converse well the user. So I think I'm out of time, but happy to have questions and thanks for listening.
For the actual LLM code generation thing, I get that you asked the LLM for things like constraints and hierarchy and whatnot. I think I missed how you actually generate the program from that.
Yeah, I skipped over that. So there's a couple of strategies. The one that we showed you was just a simple shot, a really simple shot experiment, where you give it a big prompt, which is here's a language and here are 5 example programs in it. Sure. So just say, please generate a program with the specification and constraints. We've also tried experiments with doing this hierarchically, which I think is the way we're moving forward on this, which is where you first ask it to create the tree structure. Like, what parts are in this object? Okay, what parts are in these subparts? What parts are in these subparts? And then you can ask it for the relationships. I didn't have time to get into the details, but we have different kinds of constraints, both between like the high level objects, so it's kind of abutting and what is the positioning of these subparts. And then we also have traditional low level CAD constraints, like these 2 lines of coincidence, these points are touching, etc. And some of the big technical machinery of that is actually that in like traditional CAD program, all these constraints problems are solved in like a linear sequence. If we make a sketch that's solved and that's fixed, then it goes to the next level of generation. But for a system where you want to be defining your geometry via constraints primarily, having this sequenced border becomes a problem because you might not know ahead of time like what the dimension. As a human playing this, I can go back and make edits and think ahead and say, okay, I need this latch to fit onto this hoop later on. But if you're defining something purely by constraints, you need to have all of those variables be free at the constraint solver side. So there's a whole mechanism there about having this hierarchical dynamic constraint solver to be able to solve these large constraint problems as well.
But still, the actual program generation is open, for lack of a better word, because you're having the LLM predict as opposed to having
It's
PSL.
open. There is a feedback mechanism as well, so you can kind of, it can generate it. If there's a problem, it will like.
Yeah, because you execute it, right?
Yeah, so you can execute. So there's a bunch of things to explore in how to properly do feedback loops. What's the right way of doing like using tree synchronous, like you might go down the wrong path and go back. So there's a bunch of exploration on how to actually instrument the prompting on this. So far, what we have is some experiments on doing hierarchical planning prompting. Most of the things that we've shown are single shot prompting or simple, like one type of hierarchy.
Okay.
When you're creating that synthetic data set, right? I was wondering how you said that you deformed some of the objects.
Yeah.
To basically increase the data set size, I guess.
It's not to increase the data set size, it's to have correspondence pairs.
Okay.
So if I want to like say have this chair and a slightly more different chair, I want to just make a small edit to this that is representative of the kinds of edits that somebody would make when they're doing design iteration. So we only have single designs in our actual in the wild data set, and we need modifications of those. And so the edits we're making are to make the modifications where a lot of the part is the same, but little pieces of them have changed. And then what our data set is correspondence pairs between the original and the modified. Yeah.
So it's like a generalized thing, right? It's or is it based on like you like generally just edit it, like how do you constrain that? How much do you change in order for it to be like useful in the sense like you said that you should change a chair to be a chair, right? How do you know?
So
what's
in CAD parts, usually like when you get down to individual parts, you're not looking at whole chairs. You're usually looking at this is the bracket that's used to connect the back of the chair.
Right.
So one of the things we have to actually validate, which is what the validation is done for, is that even though we're making fairly abstract looking changes that don't semantically look at the real change you make, they are operationally the same kinds of changes people make, extruding things, putting holes in things, changing the dimensions of things. And what we found is that statistically, the types of changes that were made matched pretty well with the types of changes we saw in the small curated data sets of changes. And also the fact that even training on these changes that looked really artificial, we got very good transfer results onto real data. Like we got pretty much the same accuracy. So yeah, that's kind of this part of the reason, like do synthetic edits work on this? And yeah, they do, which is cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned that one of the difficulties with LLM is it struggles with geometry.
Yeah.
So I guess can you comment on, from a user experience perspective, that by sort of like using this like textual prompting to create a certain shape, like how much difficult would it be versus just like, like traditionally just adding like the object itself?
So yeah, so there is, I think this is actually getting to a whole separate problem, in fact, that LLMs are bad at geometry, which is that describing kind of geometry that exists in CAD in pure text is not very easy. Like sketches or even functionality are probably a better way of expressing these things. And so like that interface does require thought. But from the point of view of the geometry, like being bad at geometry itself, you could, consider a user who doesn't know how to use a graphical category of someone as a user being bad at geometry. This, lowers the floor and letting them be able to design objects. But like the idea behind using the constraint-based solver is that you don't need to actually specify the geometry directly. You can specify the functionality. In this case, functionality is very broadly being defined as, these things attached to each other at roughly these positions. But you can imagine, and like stuff we're not having these like projects I'm working on now, which are, in specified subfields, you have more mechanistic or functional definitions of what these constraints are. Like for crystal design, what is the symmetry group they are in, for example, is something that I'm looking at right now.
So I guess like, say if I want to like draw like a pad of like a pump of a car, like to what extent is it just like easier for me to just like cat that myself versus like prompting and asking the.
So if you know exactly what a hub looks like and what all constraints are to make a hub valid, great, go ahead and do it yourself. But let's say that I am trying to make a light switch plate cover for US standard electrical outlet. I could go over and measure or look online all of the relevant dimensions and all of the codes. Or I could trust that my large language model has ingested a million documents about that. And I don't, that's the design that my functional requirement is, I want this to fit over my light switch plate. If I just say that, and the generalized language models has inbuilt knowledge, then then it could bring that to bear to generate the constraints that say these need to be X far apart and X far apart this way, et cetera. So you're kind of trying to offload some of the design constraints from your mechanistic geometric definition into kind of a fuzzy natural language definition, which I think is, in my opinion, of where the strength of language models lies, is in shifting where the interface is and shifting like the responsibilities, especially in objective functions. So a lot of things that we want to optimize over are very hard to express concretely, even for people who know how to express objective functions. For people who don't know how to write objective functions, it's very hard to write them. But language models provide a way of going from a fuzzy description into an objective or a constraint. It's kind of neat.
Yeah, okay. I think we can wrap up. So let's thank our speaker one more time.